What is going on, everybody? Another dirty dozen, and this time it is the French defense. The French defense is a defense for black. After e4 is pushed, they play e6. It's the only time I'm going to say it. Every trap is going to start with e4, e6. We're going to start off with an easy one, d4, d5, e takes d5, e takes d5. Very common move after white plays knight f3 is the bishop will come to d6. We're going to play c4, and the knight usually doesn't come to f6, but rather e7, because it protects the f5 square for the light squared bishop. But if they play that, it's already game over with c5. The dark squared bishop is trapped and has nowhere to go without being captured. Here's a real quick one for black. After d4 and d5, if white chooses to defend the e4 pawn with the f pawn rather than a minor piece, we're going to go ahead and capture, and upon recapture, we have queen h4 check. If they run, then we have capturing the e4 pawn. We're going to be up and have an excellent game. And if they defend by pushing g3, the check on e4 comes with the threat of picking up the rook in the corner. So after they parry the threat of check, we pick up the rook, and we're going to have an excellent game from there. On to the next. This trap for white is about as simple as it gets. After d4, d5, knight comes to c3, and after d takes e4, knight takes e4. Black will bring the knight out, developing to the standard square of f6. We're going to go ahead and bring the bishop to d3, and if black takes the free pawn on d4, simply bishop to b5 is check. No matter what black does, they're going to lose the queen to your queen. If they block the check with their queen on d7, you could pick it up with the bishop. But other than that, once they block the check, you're going to go ahead and scoop it up with the queen. And that is about as simple as a trap as I know. On to the next. Here's another very simple trap for white. After d4, d5, and knight c3, d5 captures e4, and knight captures e4. If they develop their knight to standard position f6, instead of capturing, we're going to defend it, hoping that they do gobble up the poison pawn. What if they don't, and they just take on the knight on e4? We simply want to recapture with our bishop, and a pretty common move for black at this point is to push c5, attacking the d4 pawn. And we can try pushing the c pawn to c3 to defend it. And after c captures d4 and c captures d4, black might want to set up a simple tactic to try to win that pawn with bishop to b4 check. And once we block, obviously it would be putting the bishop in front of the queen, so that pawn would be free. So after bishop d2 and queen grabs d4, that would be a horrible mistake as well, because queen to a4 check will win the dark squared bishop after the check is parried. So let's say they bring the bishop to d7. That's when we can go ahead and pick up the dark squared bishop for free. And that's an easy one. On to the next. Here is a nice easy one for black in the exchange variation. So that goes d4, d5, e takes d5, and e takes d5. White's going to go ahead and push c4, hitting our d5 pawn again. And that's when we're going to bring out our knight to f6, protecting it. White's going to come in and pin our knight, and we're going to go ahead and bring our bishop out now to e6, adding another defender to the d5 pawn. Here, white does capture the d5 pawn, and we're going to recapture with the bishop. And this is when white brings out the knight to c3, attacking our bishop. We do have a defender, the queen, other than the knight that protects it, so we're going to ignore it for now and bring out our knight to c6. White has the idea of grabbing the bishop, and then after we recapture, hitting our knight, so we screw up our pawn structure on our king side, but that's not going to go well for them. After knight grabs d5 bishop, and we recapture. If they execute their plan and grab our knight on f6, it's no good for them. We have the nasty trick, bishop to b4 check. They only have one piece to block the check, and that is their queen. So if they block the check, we're going to be a huge exchange up, and the only other option for them would be to run with their king. If they do so and bring their king to e2, queen e4 is checkmate. That seals the deal. That's an easy one for you, and on to the next. Here's a nice one for black in the Tarrasch. The Tarrasch is after d4, d5, white plays knight to d2. You want to go ahead and push c5. White will take on d5 with their e4 pawn. You want to recapture with e6. And then they'll take on your c5 pawn, and you want to recapture with your dark squared bishop. If white makes the mistake of jumping their knight to e2, lights out. Queen b6 will do the job, and you're threatening bishop to f2 checkmate. They have no pieces that they can block the check with other than the knight to d4. You want to go ahead and capture the knight, and you're still threatening the same checkmate. So they're going to have a nice time getting rid of that, but you're at least going to be a minor piece up. The only other option is to open up a escape square. Their first option, which doesn't lead to a checkmate, is knight to e4. If that's the case, you just want to capture the knight with your pawn that's on d5. And you're still threatening checkmate with, bishop f2. Once the king goes d2, you got queen e3 for checkmate. And the other square is if the knight comes to c4. If that's the case, it's attacking your queen, but you want to throw in a check first. The king is going to have to escape on d2, and that's when you can take the knight with the pawn. There's only two continuations which don't lead to checkmate. Their best bet is honestly bringing the queen to e1, giving it up. And before you take the queen, you want to throw in a check with your queen on either d6 or d8. Both work. And then the king will have to march to c3. And then once that happens, then you can take on the queen with the bishop. And if they block with the knight jumping to d4, then that puts you in check. You can take the queen then, the king will take your bishop, and then you pick up the knight. The only other option is, besides marching over the queen, the king can go to c3, and it's an extensive line of checkmate, which is up to checkmate in 18. But it's going to start off with bringing the queen over to f6. And their best move, honestly, from here is bringing the queen right to d4. If you see the analysis 15.8, and it's still the same over here. It is, in fact, their best move. And that's the way the cookie crumbles. So you could have a good time figuring out the continuation from this, because it would take about a half hour for me to do so. On to the next. Here's a nice little trap for black. After d4, d5, and knight c3, we're going to go ahead and take on the e4 pawn. And it's a gambit by playing knight to e2. It's called the Rubinstein variation. And this is when we're going to bring out the bishop to b4, pinning the knight to the king. And here, white's going to try to kick our bishop with a3. And that's our cue to go ahead and take out the knight with our bishop on c3. White will recapture with the knight on e2, and that's when we're going to go ahead and bring out our knight to c6. And if white tries bringing the queen out to g4, hitting the weak g7 pawn, we're going to ignore that, and we're just going to pick up the pawn on d4. And if white goes ahead and takes the pawn on g7, that is game over. Checkmate in 2. Knight captures c2 check. King has one square to go to, which is e2. And we finish him off with queen to d3. Checkmate. That is a nice little trap in the Win-A-War variation, more specifically, once again, in the Rubinstein variation. On to the next. Here's a pretty good one for white. After d4, d5, we're going to bring the knight to c3, and black is going to be risky and bring their knight to f6, even with the dangerous e4 pawn chilling. So we're going to bring our bishop to g5, pinning the knight, looking to push e4 in the future. And if black goes and brings the bishop to b4, pinning our knight, we have some tactics to play out. Now, even though if we push the pawn, it's not guaranteed to get a free knight, because they could always push the h and g pawn and attack our bishop, and we're not getting a free piece. That's why even with the setup, the analysis says it's even Steven. So we're going to push e5, attacking the knight with the pawn. And this is when black first is going to take out our knight on c3 with the bishop. We're going to recapture, and this is when black goes to try to push out our bishop, because if, we take the knight with the pawn, they're going to get our bishop. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to snag the knight with the pawn, and if black plays pawn captures bishop, we can go ahead and grab the g pawn as well. And we're attacking the rook. So if the rook moves over to g8, that's when we can bring our queen over to h5. And if black makes the mistake of grabbing the pawn, a very noobish mistake, then we can go queen to h8 check, and we're going to pick up the rook after the king moves. Or if they want to block with the rook and give it away that way, it's their choice. But it's a very noobish trap in the McCutcheon variation in the French. On to the next. Here's a Greek gift for white. After d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, bring out the bishop to g5, pinning the knight. And black unpins it with bishop e7. Instead of pushing the pawn up, hitting the knight, we're going to go ahead and just capture it with our bishop. After black recaptures, that's when we push the pawn. So the dark squared bishop will retreat back to e7, and that's when we bring our bishop to d3. We have a very strong center, so it's very common for black at this position to push c5. And we have to give up something, so we capture it with our d4 pawn. And black will recapture it with the bishop. That's when we come over with our queen, attacking the g7 pawn. Only logical move is to castle for black. And that's when we bring out the knight to f3. Black has to tread very lightly here. If they don't understand the Greek gift is about to go down and they make a developing move like bringing out the knight, lights out. Bishop to h7 checks the king. Once they capture, queen comes to h5 with check. Their only move is bringing back the king to g8. And that's when we bring up the knight to g5. Now, it's a checkmating pattern for white to bring the queen to h7. Black has to give up the queen and take out the knight if they want to live. It's the only way for them to go on is to give up the queen, capturing the knight. Even if they try making a running square for the king, there's a trick by going queen f7 first. Then the king's kicked to h8, and you come right back. Queen h5 check. King goes to g8, and now you do the pattern. And when queen h7 checks, king goes to f8, queen h8 check, and when the king retreats to the only square e7, because you took out that f-pawn, queen capture g7 is checkmate. If you didn't take out that f7 pawn, this wouldn't even be check, and black would survive. And that is the Greek gift in the French defense. Here's an easy one, similar to one that we covered earlier. After d4 and d5, we're going to push e5, the advanced variation. Black is going to go ahead and push out c5, and we're not going to capture, we're just going to back up with c3, making a big, nice, long pawn chain, enforcing our skeletal structure. Black will develop the knight to c6, and we'll bring our knight out to f3, countering that. Black brings out the queen to b6, eyeballing up that d4 pawn, hitting it a third time. And that's when we set the trap with bringing our bishop to d3. And if black counts, knowing that we took away one of the defenders by blocking our queen, c captures d4, pawn captures d4, knight captures d4, knight captures d4, and queen captures d4, they are busted because it's the same motif, a discovery check with bishop b5, and the queen is toast. This time, the queen doesn't even have the option to block the check once black blocks the check or moves the king. If they block the check with the bishop, go ahead and take the bishop first. And when the king recaptures, then pick up the black queen, and the rest is history. On to the next. Here's a nice one for white. d4, d5, knight c3, bishop b4, pinning the knight. Pawn pushes e5, and we're going to push c5. That's when they push a3, and we're going to go ahead and capture. After they recapture, that's when we bring our knight out to e7, inviting a queen to g4, hitting the weak g7 pawn. But we're going to ignore that and just bring our queen out nice and cool to c7. Once the queen captures g7, we slide our rook over to g8, and they'll take on the h7 pawn. That's when we'll capture d4, and if they recapture, we got queen c3, hitting the king, checking. Doesn't matter if they move it or protect it with the bishop. We pick up the rook in the corner, and it's GG. On to the next. One more for white. After d4, d5, and e5, black pushes c5, and we push c3. Knight c6, knight f3, and queen to b6. We already had this position in a trap prior to this, where the bishop came out to d3. How about this one, though? Capture c5, inviting black to make a battery aiming at f2. Well, we need to guard the f2 pawn, so we bring our queen out to c2. And if the black king wants to castle, it has to find a place for the knight, and it can't come to f6 because the pawn, so it has to come out to e7. But then it's apparent that b4 traps the dark squared bishop, and you're going to have an excellent game from here. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the Dirty Does of the French variation, and drop a line in the comments which one of the Dirty Dozen you'd like to see next. Thank you very much, and I'll see you on the next.